Hello, I'm Gina Glover. I'm a photographic artist. I make personal projects generally to do with memory, and I'm also co-founder of an organisation called Photofusion, which is a photography centre in London. There I do a lot of mentoring, and I'm very involved with the gallery and the projects that we do there. I also make artworks in hospitals, something that is, I feel, very involved in, and I very much like the process of collaborating. So most of my projects, in whatever field that I'm working with, involves collaboration in some kind of way. Playgrounds of Awe has been an exhibition and project that I've been thinking about and involved in for a very long time, and therefore it consists of quite different elements. There are scanograms, pictures of artifacts that I've collected. There are black and white photographs dating back to 1980s, consisting of a small child playing on a nuclear missile site. And then there are the large Pinhole pictures, which are much more recent pictures because my practice in terms of making artworks is using a Pinhole camera. A lot of my work really comes out of my own personal history, and the site that I started making this work on is a place very near where I grew up, and I used to go there and have very happy memories of picnicking, but I never realised that it was really a site of war. This was really kept as a secret. I don't think people of my parents' generation very much talked about the war. They wanted to move on from that. And in fact, my father was in the Secret Service, and so it had another kind of significance and secrecy for me. And so when I began to uncover that it had this history, I became really interested to find out more, and realised it had a collective history for a lot of people and a lot of local people. And this history was about a Second World War aerodrome, where the Americans flew the French resistance into France. But it was also because it had become a military space. It later, in the late 50s, became a site for the Cold War, and there was a Thor nuclear missiles there, all ready and erect during the Cuban crisis. And what you find in these places is a kind of memory of the place, but it isn't obvious. You have to, through the debris and the artifacts and the things that you collect, find a history, and you're almost becoming an archaeologist, beginning to kind of understand what you're actually seeing. And that's why I started really the series, where I'm showing a small child actually playing on the site who had no understanding of actually what she was playing with. But because of the atmosphere of the landscape, the wind, and the fact that the farmland had just in those days been burnt, the stubble had been burnt, and therefore she was sort of responding to these huge concrete blast shields and the point and sort of placement of where these rockets had stood, but had no understanding. And then gradually, like her, I began to have an understanding of actually the two things I began to understand. One, of the bravery of a young American air pilots who were flying very dangerous missions into France, where there was a considerable loss of life, and where the spies, the Joes that were dropped into France, often had a very unwelcome time and were imprisoned. So these stories that I began to uncover, and people began to tell me, and people began to give me artifacts and things. This land sort of, it's almost as if the land itself holds stories, and therefore, quite understandably, you also get stories of ghost stories and things like that. And this led me to think where these missiles and where these drop zones might be. And so this exhibition, Playgrounds of Awe, is local to the UK, and then very much to Scotland, and my investigation of places these sort of artifacts that you can stumble upon and not quite understand in Scotland. And one of the pictures that I was most pleased about, which is a Pinhole picture, was of the control tower in Dallashay. And because the control towers, which were there during the Second World War, are becoming really quite rare monuments. Most of them have been destroyed. And it's in the same way that these airfields, unless they've continually been used, are also becoming buried, and that history is becoming buried for people. And I think for young people today, they have, the Cold War is something that perhaps comes up in school, but there isn't such a huge understanding of it. And yet, in fact, we're about to have, the 50 years, it's going to be 50 years since the Cold War that is coming up. And in fact, that was, it could have been horrendous. The bombs, the Thor missiles that were opposite, in fact, I now live, actually were 100 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. So we're talking about something that shouldn't be forgotten. But I suppose as a photographer and as an artist, what attracts me is that I'm not looking at a memorial and in terms of a sort of very clear-cut, set-in-stone place. What I'm coming across are places that are kind of arbitrary, that are left for nature to take over. And I suppose there's part of me that wants nature to take it over, and yet I feel it should still, that story should be told and be part of a sort of conscious memory of everybody. And it's this play of these two different things, that what is exciting is actually that the wasteland of this place makes you feel that you're trespassing and you're not quite understanding what you're looking at. And this was particularly so when I was travelling in places that I didn't know so well, like in Scotland, or when I moved to Eastern Europe, and I came across places in Latvia. There's a series of 3 pictures that was very difficult to find. And my research for these places, in fact, happens on the internet. But then when you actually go there, you come very, you're always taken by surprise to see how nature has actually dealt with what you're looking at. The other photographs that are in this exhibition come from Piemundi, which of course was where the V2 rocket was made. And there I was extremely lucky, because actually when you photograph a museum, with a pinhole camera, to get an atmosphere is quite difficult. But the day I arrived, it was really snowing. In fact, you can't quite see this, but it was a complete snow cloud. And that gave to me a feeling of that place, and an understanding of that history where slave labour and the conditions, and we all know, kind of what happened there, and actually how horrendously frightening and powerful the V2 bomb was during the Second World War. And of course, what they're talking about there in terms of the captions at that museum was actually how that led on to sort of modern technology. And in fact, it led on to the technology that was used in the Thor nuclear missiles. So there's a sort of circular process that is happening with that. I use a very small little pinhole camera, and it delights me very much that, in fact, this camera I buy on the internet, and it's just a very small box with as we know, just a little pin, and I use colour roll film. And there's something that I like, the fact that it's just a very small artifact that I use, that I can just have in my pocket. And although in fact I know exactly what I'm doing and I can work out the exposures, it is something that I feel I can play with, and it has a sort of playfulness, which, although this exhibition is about a serious subject, the way I like to take my photographs is quite playful. And at the same time, I like the fact that it isn't hard-edged. There is a sort of grainy quality. You're not using a lens. And I suppose this comes out of the fact that I trained as a painter. And I feel I'm really painting with light. I'm layering light in the same way that I'm talking about memory and I'm talking about the past. And therefore I feel this camera is the right camera to use when you are trying to depict things that are very much in personal and collective memory.